Okay, I am very, very pleased to be introducing Courtney Dean and having this conversation with her on beaver dam impacts on water quality, biodiversity, and trout populations in Wisconsin streams. So let me just introduce you, Courtney. Courtney is a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Stout in the PSM Conservation Biology program. In her previous career, she practiced as a cytotechnologist where she focused on microscopic diagnosis of cancer and infectious processes. She is a native Wisconsinite, focusing her research on examining how beaver dams impact ecosystems and species richness using bioacoustics and environmental DNA. And let me just say for the record that Courtney and I decided to do this presentation as a conversation because we had so much fun getting together and talking about the subject. We just thought it would be a fun way to do it. So Courtney, let's start with the obvious question. What made you switch careers and start to focus on beavers?
Well, I'm sure it's not a surprise to anyone. Enduring COVID in the healthcare industry was not a great time. I've been toying with the idea of going back to graduate school, and that was a good reason to leave. Initially, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted it to be something local that impacted our community. And I read Ben Goldfarb's Eager, and the rest is history. So
So before we have our conversation about your research, we kind of have to put the research in the context of Wisconsin's beaver management policy. So my understanding is that the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources contracts with the USDA Wildlife Services to lethally manage Wisconsin's beaver population in order to protect its trout streams. And it's estimated that the state pays $500,000 a year to the USDA to carry out this program. We'll be hearing more about the plan during our next session with Bill Nelson. But, why is this policy in place? So the policy is in place to protect the trout population for Wisconsin's trout fishermen. But if you look at the data, if you extrapolate the data, um, less than 3% of Wisconsin's residents actually fish for trout.
correct.
What else can you tell us about the plan?
Well, the plan is designed to keep the designated trout streams free flowing because the beavers are essentially managed in the state of Wisconsin as a nuisance species. Emily touched on this a little bit earlier. Um, there, the trapping regulations, there is a season, but there are no bag limits within the state during those trapping seasons. And I think the representative from the DNR said that the regulations were very permissive as to what a landowner can do in relation to a beaver. And that's basically, there's no criteria for a landowner to say this beaver is a nuisance and lethally remove it. So there's no permitting, there's no reporting. So yeah, beavers are basically treated as a nuisance, both on the trout streams for that revenue and for those anglers, and then also just within the greater viewpoint of DNR's management.
And what percentage of Wisconsin streams are managed under this policy?
It's about 15%, and the actual number from year to year, I believe, changes based on their surveys and which streams they think are important. I've heard as low as 230 and as high as 350 streams.
But it's 100% lethal management
Correct.
on those streams.
Yes, the
And
entirety of those streams are, yeah.
so let's talk about the origin of this policy. So Wisconsin's policy is based on research that was conducted by Ed Avery 20 plus years ago. And we know that there were some methodological flaws to his research. For example, I understand that he did not use control streams in his research.
Correct.
So what else can you tell us about Ed Avery's research?
Well, so the study in question was the results were published in 2002, but it was done on one large watershed, which is great. But the beavers were 100% removed from the entire watershed for 10 years. So we're talking like 550 beaver dams were removed off of the streams within that watershed over the course of the study. And then when Ed came in and did his portion of the research, he only looked at water flow, water temperature, and then the fish species assemblage. So there was no larger context of what removing those beaver dams did to the the ecological functionality or the biodiversity. Didn't look at water quality impacts or anything like that. So it was very limited in scope. And the problem is that the results of his study have been informing our beaver management policy going forward.
And we know that today research is being conducted by WDNR Fisheries. The team is headed up by Dr. Matt Mitro. What can you tell us about his study design and his research team and his findings?
Sure. We don't know findings yet because that hasn't been published. The great thing about his study is they are doing it across the entire state. So it has a much broader scope than anything that's been done up to this point. The problem is that it's a fisheries study. It's not an interdisciplinary study. It's not an ecological impact study. It is a study designed to look at how beaver impact trout streams, trout size, angler experience, those sorts of things. So it's not a bad study. It's just a very myopic study. And the concern is that this limited scope study is going to be informing beaver policy for the next 10, 20, 50 years here in the state.
So the study design is not really looking at ecological impacts, water quality metrics, biodiversity analysis.
Right. And this goes back to what Dr. Fairfax was talking about, that many of the studies that have been done in the area, they're just about beaver and trout. There's not an ecosystem-wide analysis. We don't know. We don't know how it's impacting biodiversity or water quality. We see these studies happening out west, but they aren't happening here in the Midwest.
Tell us about the Sean Johnson Bice literature review.
I love this article. It was published in 2018, and we'll give links to it. This graphic is quite messy, but this gentleman reviewed beaver salmonid research that had been done in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and he came up with 21 studies. And you can see all the fancy data here, but what's notable is that a lot of the studies, more than half, are anecdotal or mixed. They're not sort of up to the scientific standard that we have today, yet they're still informing policies across the region. They have limited scopes. Some of these are done on one stream, on a tributary, on 5 streams, very limited in scale. And again, you can see only very few of them looked at water chemistry components. None of them are looking at biodiversity components. And then when you look at stream temperature, which is like one of those sort of calling cards that beavers raise temperatures and are bad for trout, you can look down this column and see that there is no consensus. So the data that we do have gives no consensus, yet we're still supporting policies that say beavers raise temperatures and it's bad for trout, period, end of sentence. But the data doesn't support it.
Okay, so this slide, we're sort of talking about the impact of these data gaps.
Yeah, it's and again, a lot of this speaks to what Dr. Fairfax mentioned as well, is that we have issues with the studies that have been done. They're limited in scope, and then we have research that's being done elsewhere in Europe and out west. And the attitudes that I've heard in meetings with folks from the DNR and stakeholders is that, oh well, that's out west, that's different, it doesn't apply to us. And while certainly it's true that there are differences, low gradient streams are low gradient streams regardless of where they happen. And so we need to be sort of looking at the research that's happening out there and saying, hey, how can we apply that here? Does that work here? Does it apply to our situation, rather than either doing nothing or reinventing the wheel, which again is exactly what Dr. Fairfax talked about.
So if we were gonna consider some of these other community impacts of our beaver management plan, what would we be looking at?
Well, my favorite factoid, and this was from the DNR, I was a little surprised when I saw it pop up, is that a full 70% of the population of the state of Wisconsin gets their tap and drinking water from groundwater supplies. So when we start looking at how we view beavers and how we manage them and what services they're providing, what percentage of the population, the trout fishing is important, and no one's saying it's not. But it's really only something that benefits less than 3% of our state's population. When we look at hydrologic issues, water quality issues, that alone is 70% of the state. When we start talking about flood and drought mitigation, wildfire buffers, managing erosion, all of those sorts of things, now you're talking about the entirety of the state. So the scales seem tipped policy-wise in favor of trout anglers, but the reality is, the things that beavers can address are affecting the entirety of the state.
And if I could say something that might be a little bit controversial, but is also true, we know that many state departments of natural resources get their operating revenue from revenue that they earn from the hunting and fishing industries. So that could lead to a bias in policy and decisions that are being made that are not in the best interest of the public. They do not follow the principles laid out under the public trust doctrine. So I just think it's, we have to be honest about what's going on here, even if that, might offend some people.
And in the interest of full transparency, we've been in I've been in a number of meetings with Wisconsin DNR folks, and I've heard them say things like, we can't let science dictate all the policy. We have to worry about consumer and customer experience and outcomes. And in that case, we're talking about trout anglers. So there's some concerns with that. Yeah.
That's right. So I love this slide. I always work it in if I get the opportunity. So this is an image that explains how streams function with beavers on them. So in the square all the way to the left, you can see we've got an incised stream. There's not much riparian vegetation, and someone has added some beaver dam analogs. The next square to the right, you can see that the stream is widening, and the BDAs are starting to impound water and sediment. In the next square to the right, you can see that the stream is being reconnected to its floodplain. Beavers have shown up because now the velocity of the water is slower so that they can survive there. And they're taking over managing the BDAs that were installed, and they're building their own dams, and there's more riparian vegetation. And then in the square all the way to the right, we can see the result is a complex river wetland corridor. The water table is higher. There are these side passages that would allow for fish migration. There's more biodiversity. The water table is higher. And there's something going on called hyporic exchange, which is when the water in the surface and the water in the ground water, which is cooler, they mix together. So that would lower temperatures. And it's also, there's a lot of microhabitats here for fish and amphibians and other animals at different, that's hospitable to them at different stages of their life cycle. So if you're looking at the square all the way to the left, you might think, yeah, I could see where a trout would have a hard time passing by these dams, or I could see where this water would heat up because it's so simplified. But once you get to this more complex river wetland corridor, you're going to have those impediments are going to disappear, and also you have a river system that is dynamically stable. So Emily, Dr. Fairfax touched upon this about how complex systems are more resilient to pressure such as climate change. So I just wanted to put that into context. So now let's take a bird's eye view at some of your research sites.
Yes. So this is the one closest to my home. I visit it all the time. It's near and dear to my heart. But and this is probably 3 years old, this photo. So it doesn't quite match what we have today. But you can see the red arrows are indicating where the beaver dams are by those blue solid lines. This is a class 2 Wisconsin trout stream. It is low gradient, and it is very, very well connected to its floodplain. So you can see not only the size of these dams. I mean, these are the scale down at the bottom is, at 100 feet. This is quite high level. These dams are huge, and they are pushing an incredible amount of water out onto the landscape because it's connected. The dam that is there today would actually be a little bit off the screen to the right. It is so large, it is holding about 1 million cubic meters of water, which is something like 400 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of water being held onto the landscape. If you click to that next photo, Rachel, you can see this is actually down on the ground at this complex, and these dams are not very large. These are maybe 3 feet tall at their tallest spot. They're holding back just an incredible amount of water. And what's, again, that dynamically stable portion last year, just like Dr. Fairfax said, we were in a drought through all the way up and through November. And this site looks the same today after we're something like 6 inches over where we should be this year precipitation wise. It looks the same today as it did last autumn when we were in an extreme drought. So this is a stable habitat. It is a complex habitat, and it's providing a ton of services to our community with groundwater and flood mitigation. It's just a very dynamic, amazing site. If you click to the next slide, this is another site in my research study. And this is a bit of an incised stream. It's not terribly incised, also low gradient, also class 2 trout stream. But you can see because the stream is incised, the beaver ponds, they're noticeable, but they're very contained within the channel of the stream. So what is happening at this site is completely different than what is happening at that other site. So there's a component here that we don't fully understand, is how are beavers functioning? What do the ecosystem services look like in an incised stream versus a restored stream or a connected stream? If you go to the next slide, you can see the on the ground, the boots on the ground photo here. That beaver dam is over in the middle of the image on the right. And it's holding back water, but you can see the type of habitat that is present here at this beaver dam is completely different than that site we saw before. So, not all beaver dams are created equally, and we really don't understand yet, because there's such a lack of data, what the difference is. And this dam is certainly an impediment to trout, whereas the one before is definitely not. So.
Okay, so now I know you're still conducting your
Yep.
research, compiling your results, but can you give us an idea of what you're looking for and what you're finding?
Sure. So last year in 2023, we did a pilot study to sort of assess what were the issues that were most necessary and what was the data sort of pointing to, so we could target our research this year. We had 3 beaver dam sites with 3 controls paired up with each one. And we did a whole host of water quality metrics. What was interesting is that we did see a reduction downstream of the beaver dams, a statistically significant reduction in inorganic nitrogen, which is most likely from runoff from fertilizers, agriculture. But we also noticed the statistically significant decrease in chloride levels in the water. And that is coming from road salt. And it's an emerging issue. The salt can stay in our water system for something like 50 years. So it's an emerging issue that we know we need to address, but we don't have a solution for right now. So we're following that lead this year. Last year, we did fairly rudimentary avian biodiversity measures. And we did see a 160% increase in species richness at beaver dam sites as compared to the free-flowing streams. This year, we've gotten considerably more technologically advanced, and we are using bioacoustic surveys to not just track birds, but also to track bats and anurans, and get some diversity measures at each of our sites. We have been measuring temperature spatially, both upstream, downstream, surface, bottom of the pond. We continue to do that now. And then also the trout utilization of beaver ponds. It's a sticky wicket. Dr. Mitro's study is not actually doing it either because it is so difficult. Electrofishing has proven to be logistically impossible. So our goal this fall with some of our undergraduates is to try using environmental DNA analysis to see how the trout are moving in, around, upstream, downstream of beaver ponds, and then compare that to sites where we know they've been stocked by the DNR.
So the eDNA would tell you both the level of a type of fish that's there and what type of fish is there, like the native brown trout versus
Sure.
non-native, right?
Yep. And a lot of that will come down to how we're able to actually design the study. But yes, that's the goal, is can we see differences or similarities in the amount of eDNA, say in a beaver pond versus downstream of that beaver pond? And then what does that look like compared to an area we stocked in a free-flowing stream by the DNR? So are the numbers comparable? Are the fish actually moving up and downstream of that, or are they not? So.
Okay, oops. Okay, I love this image.
So, well, and I don't know how many people, bioacoustics is sort of new. I don't know how many people are familiar with it. It's essentially an auditory trail camera. You can see in the image over on the right, circled up there that's the recording device. So we put them up about 12 feet off the ground. And we've got a unit at each site that is for ultrasonic recording for bat, and then a traditional microphone recording for birds. The anurins, road noise, thunder, you get everything with that one. But you can see this analysis is one that we've run on one of our bat vocalization collections. And you can see we've got 4 consecutive calls from a big brown bat here, those longer swooshes along the bottom. And then you have that shorter, shallower swoosh, which is a silver-haired bat. So we're able to use a little bit of AI and a little bit of pattern matching to do some of this analysis, which was really fantastic.
Yes, so clever. A good use of AI, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, what are some of the challenges that you faced with your research?
Oh gosh. I will say the number one challenge is finding sites and getting access to them, because of the state policies that we've discussed before. It's been very necessary to find beaver dams on private land where there's one landowner on both sides of the stream, if that makes sense. If we have conflicting landowners on either side, we know that beaver dam could be removed at a moment's notice. So we really had to rely on social media and community forums to sort of find not only the beaver sites, but then to find landowners who want to have researchers on there and want to keep the beaver, and who will say no potentially to the DNR if they were to come on and try and remove that dam. Yeah, it's been a challenge. We've been really lucky to find 6 very willing landowners, but yeah, that was a difficult thing to do. As we talked about the trout sampling logistics within the beaver ponds, we know that these are messy, complex habitats and pools, and that's what we want them to be, because that's what makes them work so well, but they're very difficult to electrofish. So finding a workaround for that has been a bit of a challenge. And then just the natural chaotic process of working in the field. We've had beavers migrate out of sites. We've had dams notched, even on streams that weren't slated to be notched or managed. We've had somebody trespassing on private land to try and trap a beaver. And then, with the massive precipitation events we've had, we have had some breaches. So, there's chaos to it. But it's been really good. We've been getting really great data, and I'm really excited to publish.
Great. So I think Bob is going to come on and see if there's any questions for us.
Okay. And the one thing I wanted to say is that if you have an issue in your community, whether it's water-based or ecologically based, whatever, do the research, find a way to work with some folks, and just do the research, because the data is not out there. And this is the only way you're going to change people's sort of hearts and minds. So if you're at all inclined, take on the challenge.
You're muted, Bob.
Sorry. Thank you, Courtney. That was great. One of the questions is that there was a concern or a question, and I don't know if it's even measurable, about spawning temperatures in sized versus widened streams, and also streams that are affected by cattle, where they're in there in terms of breaking down banks. And let's say, what's the intersection with beaver and cattle in streams?
This is a really, really complex. This is one of those things where you have a ball of yarn and you start pulling and you've got 50 different threads sitting in your hands. The spawning habitat is certainly a concern. One of the things that I have a concern with is yes, we're focusing a lot on habitat for adult trout, and we're focusing a lot on having spawning habitat. But where are those young fish going? Like, where is the habitat for the fry to avoid predators, to have particularly, nutrient dense feeding areas? We're kind of leaving out that middle portion, and that's where I think beaver can come into play, because we know beaver create both deep and shallow water, increased nutrients, and certainly macroinvertebrates and insects, which all benefit trout. So it's a really complicated piece of the puzzle. A beaver dam isn't going to fix every trout issue, but it could certainly address some specific targeted issues.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, says what kind of trout eDNA are you investigating? And I guess the other question would just be, maybe you could explain eDNA and how those traces are cataloged and how you track that for biodiversity.
Absolutely. Yeah, so eDNA, environmental DNA, is that every living being is shedding cells or particles sort of into the environment as they're just navigating through it. So environmental DNA is collecting trace amounts of DNA, and you match it against, they call it a primer. So it would be the species of interest. For us, it would be primarily brook trout, because that's the species, that's our only native trout species here in Wisconsin. But also, brown trout are in our streams as well. Certainly, if you could expand the scope of this, you could really get down to the nitty gritty of the species assemblages in each stream. But our target is brook trout.
Okay. The other, there was just a question here. Is there any other advice about using the audio portions for other, I guess, other surveying, whether it's bats, birds, using any other way? Any additional advice regarding using also eDNA in beaver habitat, since you're there in terms of lesson learned, perhaps?
Yes, and we're still working on actually deploying the eDNA, so that's sort of a to be continued. I've had a lot of calls with folks in Australia who've been, and New Zealand, who have done a lot of this research. So I'm hoping to glean, take some of the mistakes they've made and apply them, avoid them here in applying some new techniques. But
Okay.
as far as the bioacoustics, it's really easy to use. There's a lot of software out there to help analyze the data, which makes it manageable. But I would recommend doing a little bit of research to figure out the deployment techniques. Ours, the bird ones record 1 minute out of every 10 minutes to minimize the total amount of data, but we have them out in the field for 7 days total. So there's some sort of industry standards that are starting to be published about how you deploy the units and how long you deploy them. So I would dig into that a little bit and find out what is the best method for what you're wanting to look at.
Another question is there any data being collected as far as habitat and foraging plants that beavers are accessing, and they seem to, we'll call it the favorite foods, or you notice some of the called the trophic changes that are happening because of this foraging plants and different seasonal times when the plants may be responding to beaver?
That's an excellent question and a wonderful topic for some research. We do have a professor at Stout who's working with some of my research sites, and she's been doing vegetative analysis of the beaver dams and comparing that to some traditional wetlands to see if the species assemblages are different. I don't know of anybody who's doing the work as far as how these species assemblages or favored plants are changing in relation to climate change. That's a fantastic topic for a study.
Okay. One of the conflicts of in terms of, I guess, in your research, what are some of we'll call it the obstacles that you see that could be done policy-wise that would make this kind of research easier to conduct, more available to a broader audience of researchers or interns like yourself? Because it sounds like there's some institutional problems with the way beavers are managed in Wisconsin.
I mean, what I would really like to see is just a different attitude in approaching how we deal with beaver on the landscape and beaver-human conflict. I mean, California just passed legislation where it requires landowners to use non-lethal methods before resorting to lethal methods when managing beaver conflict. When the state policies basically treat an animal as a nuisance along with coyotes and squirrels and raccoons, it's hard to convince the community that these species have value and that they belong on our landscape and that we can work with them. So I would love to see sort of a different attitude in these policies, saying, hey, let's try and find a way to work with these species and leave them on the landscape where we can, rather than just saying, if you don't like it, you can go ahead and kill it. So, I mean, that would certainly make my job easier to have more access to research sites. But I think changing the trout management policy is going to be a really, really big uphill battle.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a
Thank
great
you.
presentation.